Today I want to talk about something that has been sitting in my head for a while, and I think a lot of people who share my personality type are going to relate to this deeply. I want to talk about gaslighting, about memory, and about why people like me tend to remember conversations so vividly, sometimes to the point where it feels more like a burden than a gift. And I also want to share a little bit about where I think this comes from, because for me, it did not come from nowhere. It came from a very specific kind of childhood, and I think understanding that connection is actually really important. Let me start with the memory piece, because I think it is the foundation of everything else I want to say today. I love stories. I always have. I grew up reading books, watching different kinds of shows, getting completely absorbed in characters and their lives. When I hear people talk, I do not just hear the words. I notice the details. I remember the tone. I remember what was said and how it was said, and sometimes even the specific moment it happened. For a long time, I thought everyone experienced conversations this way. It was only later that I realized not everyone carries dialogue in their head the way I do, replaying moments, connecting them to other moments, building a kind of internal record of how interactions have unfolded over time. Now, there is a question worth thinking about here. Is this just a natural trait of people like me, or is some of it a learned behavior? And honestly, I think the answer is both. The love of stories, the attentiveness to detail, that feels like something I was born with. But the hypervigilance, the need to remember exactly what was said so I can go back and check my own version of events against what someone else might claim later, that part, I believe, is something that was trained into me by the environment I grew up in. I grew up in a chaotic household. My father struggled with addiction and alcohol. My mother, though she was present, had her own patterns that made conflict resolution nearly impossible. She was the type of person who simply could not admit to being wrong. Not in a stubborn but lovable way. In a way that was genuinely exhausting and confusing to grow up around, especially as the oldest child, because you end up carrying a lot of the emotional weight of trying to keep things together without anyone ever acknowledging how hard you are working. The message I absorbed from a very young age was that what I perceived, what I felt, what I experienced, might not be accepted as real. That I needed to be able to prove my version of events, because someone was always ready to revise it. That is the exact environment that teaches a child to remember everything. And it also, without me fully realizing it for many years, turned me into a people pleaser. Because when your home is unpredictable, when the adults around you are not consistently emotionally safe, you learn to read the room. You learn to adjust. You learn to anticipate what someone needs before they ask, because you are trying to manage the emotional temperature of the space you live in. That feels like empathy, and in some ways it is. But there is a version of it that is actually fear in disguise. You are not just being kind. You are trying to stay safe by making sure no one around you has a reason to be upset with you. Now let me explain what gaslighting actually is for anyone who is not familiar with the term, because I want to be clear about what I am describing. Gaslighting is when someone deliberately or consistently makes you question your own memory, your own perception, and your own sense of what is real. It is named after an old stage play where a husband slowly manipulates his wife into thinking she is losing her mind by secretly changing things in their environment and then denying it when she notices. In real life, gaslighting can be as obvious as someone saying that something never happened when you clearly remember it happening. Or it can be much more subtle, like someone consistently reframing situations so that your reaction to their behavior becomes the problem, rather than the behavior itself. Over time, if you are exposed to this repeatedly, you start to doubt yourself. You start to wonder if you are too sensitive, too dramatic, too quick to misread things. You start filtering your own experiences through someone else's version of reality, and that is an incredibly disorienting and exhausting place to live. Here is the thing about people like me, about INFJs specifically. We can usually recognize gaslighting when it is happening. The intuition is strong enough that even when we cannot name what is going on, we feel that something is wrong. We sense the inconsistency between what someone is saying and what actually happened. We notice the subtle shifts in how a story gets retold. We pick up on the way a conversation gets redirected when we get too close to something uncomfortable. We know. But knowing and acting on that knowledge are two very different things. And this is what I think people on the outside find hard to understand. Why would someone who can see what is happening still stay in it? Why would someone who knows they are being manipulated continue to give the benefit of the doubt? The answer, at least for me, has several layers. The first layer is love, or something that feels like love. When you care deeply about someone, whether it is a parent, a partner, a close friend, a religious community, you want to believe the best about them. You want to believe that the hurtful behavior is not the whole truth of who they are. And sometimes it genuinely is not. People are complicated. The same person who hurts you can also be the person who made you laugh, who showed you kindness at a moment you needed it, who was there during a hard time. That complexity does not disappear just because something went wrong. And for someone who naturally holds a lot of space for human complexity, letting go of that full picture and focusing only on the harmful parts is genuinely difficult. The second layer is the fear of being wrong. This sounds strange, but hear me out. When you have grown up in an environment where your perception was consistently challenged or dismissed, you develop a kind of chronic self-doubt. Even when your gut is telling you clearly that something is not right, there is a voice in the background asking, but what if I am misreading this? What if I am being unfair? What if my memory is not as reliable as I think? And that doubt, which was planted by people who had a vested interest in you not trusting yourself, ends up protecting the very behavior it was designed to hide. The third layer is something I want to describe carefully. There is a kind of hope that certain people carry, a belief that if you can just explain yourself clearly enough, if you can just find the right words, if you can just help someone understand the impact of what they did, something will shift. That they will finally get it. That the relationship will become what you always hoped it could be. And for someone who is articulate, emotionally intelligent, and deeply invested in genuine connection, giving up on that hope feels like a loss that is hard to sit with. So you try again, and again, and again. Not because you are naive, but because you genuinely believe in people's capacity to grow. The problem is that that belief, which is actually a beautiful quality in the right context, can become a trap when the other person simply does not have the same investment in honesty that you do. Let me share something personal here, though I want to be careful about how much I give away. I will use a small, simple example to illustrate the point. I was once approached by someone from my religious community while I was traveling through a different part of the city. This person asked me for money. I did not have any to give at that moment, so I said no and moved on. The second time I was approached sometime later in a completely different location, I recognized the face. I said something about it, something like, "You have asked me before." And the response was essentially a denial. The implication was that I had either imagined it or was confusing them with someone else. Now, that is a small example. It was not a relationship, it was not an emotional bond. It was just an interaction with someone I barely knew. And yet even in that small moment, I noticed something in myself. A flicker of doubt. Not because I did not remember clearly, because I did. But because when someone pushes back confidently on your version of reality, especially when you exist in a culture or a community that values deference and giving people the benefit of the doubt, there is a pull to second-guess yourself even when you should not. That flicker of doubt, in a much deeper and more sustained relationship, becomes something much more serious. When someone who is emotionally important to you consistently rewrites your shared history, tells you that what you experienced did not happen the way you remember, or makes you feel like your emotional reactions are always the real problem, that doubt stops being a flicker and starts becoming a fog. And living in that fog for long enough genuinely affects how you think and feel about yourself. Now, I want to address something that comes up a lot in conversations about this topic. Do people like me actually remember conversations that accurately, or do we sometimes fill in gaps in ways that are not fully reliable? This is a fair question, and I think the honest answer is that human memory is not perfect for anyone. We all have some degree of reconstruction happening when we recall the past. But the kind of memory that INFJs tend to develop, especially those who grew up in unpredictable environments, is less about photographic recall and more about pattern recognition. It is not always about remembering the exact words. It is about remembering the emotional texture of an interaction, the feeling of what happened, the sense of something being inconsistent or unsafe. And that kind of memory is actually quite reliable, even when the specific details shift slightly over time. The problem with gaslighting is that it specifically targets that kind of knowing. It does not just challenge the facts. It challenges the emotional truth. It tells you that the feeling you had was wrong, overblown, irrational. And for someone who has already learned to question whether their own perceptions can be trusted, that kind of challenge goes very deep. So, how do you recover from it? How do you start to rebuild trust in your own mind after it has been consistently undermined? I think the first step is simply allowing yourself to believe that what you experienced was real. Not building a legal case. Not needing the other person to validate your account. Just giving yourself permission to say, I know what I felt, and that is enough to take seriously. For people who have been conditioned to seek external validation before accepting their own experience as legitimate, this can be genuinely difficult. But it is also genuinely necessary. The second step is noticing the rumination pattern, which is something I am very familiar with. That loop where you replay a conversation in your head again and again, analyzing it from every angle, trying to figure out where things went wrong, what you could have said differently, whether you are the one who caused the problem. This kind of thinking is exhausting, and it rarely leads anywhere useful. The loop is not trying to find the truth. It is trying to find a version of events where everything makes sense and nobody really meant to cause harm. And sometimes, that version simply does not exist. Sometimes people do cause harm, and the only thing the loop is doing is keeping you stuck in proximity to the pain. The third step, which honestly takes the longest, is rebuilding a sense of your own reliability. That means starting to notice, in small, everyday moments, when your gut tells you something and you honor it. When you say, I do not feel comfortable with this, and you let that be enough of a reason. When you set a limit with someone and you hold it even when they push back. Each of those small moments is a deposit into a kind of internal trust account that gaslighting has been drawing from. You rebuild it slowly over time, through consistent practice. One more thing I want to say before I close, and this is something I think about a lot. People who gaslight others are not always doing it consciously or with deliberate cruelty. Some of them are operating from their own survival patterns, their own fear of accountability, their own inability to sit with the discomfort of being wrong. That does not excuse the behavior. But understanding it can sometimes help with the healing because it removes the part of the pain that comes from believing the person specifically intended to destroy your sense of reality. Sometimes they were just protecting themselves in the only way they knew how, at your expense. And while that is still harmful, it is a different kind of harmful than pure calculated cruelty. Knowing the difference can help you grieve the relationship without having to carry the full weight of feeling like you were specifically targeted for destruction. You were not. You were just collateral damage in someone else's war with themselves. And you deserved better than that. Thanks for watching. If this video resonated with you, please consider hitting the subscribe button. I am currently working toward my goal of 1,000 subscribers, so I can finally monetize this channel and turn this passion into a sustainable part of my future. This is my unfiltered diary of solo living in the Philippines, and your support helps me keep this channel growing. If you would like to help out even more, you can check out the Buy a Treat for My Pets link in the description. My dogs definitely appreciate the love. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update. Thank you for being such an important part of this journey. I will see you in the next one.